I was holding my champagne when he said it. Not quietly. Not accidentally. He smiled at the circle of investors around us and lifted his glass. You know what she is? He laughed. A trophy wife who got rusty. The words landed harder than the music filling the room. Some people laughed out of reflex. Others looked away. One man shifted uncomfortably beside his wife. I didn't react. Servers kept moving. Cameras flashed. The opening banner of his luxury restaurant glowed behind him like a monument to everything I had paid for. Then he pressed a white envelope into my palm. Divorce papers. At his grand opening. In front of everyone who mattered to him. I thanked him politely and walked out. They thought that was weakness. They were wrong. If you've ever been dismissed in public by someone who promised to protect you, you'll understand what that moment did to me. I didn't leave angry. I left empty. My name is Faith. For 4 years, I believed I was building a life with a man who respected me. I thought marriage meant partnership. I thought loyalty went both ways. That night taught me how wrong I was. Let me tell you how I got there. Before that night, I had learned how to be useful in ways that didn't draw attention. I managed the finances. I remembered birthdays. I smoothed over awkward dinners with investors' wives. I kept track of schedules, contracts, deadlines, and moods. I made sure the house felt calm when he came home stressed. I listened when he talked about expansion plans. I reviewed budgets when he didn't want to. I showed up to every tasting, every soft launch, every planning meeting. Not because he asked. Because that's what partnership looked like to me. I had my own career before we met. I worked in financial analysis. I understood balance sheets and projections. I knew how money moved. I also came into the marriage with an inheritance my grandmother had built through decades of discipline and careful investing. I didn't flaunt it. I invested it. When my husband started talking about opening a luxury restaurant, I believed in the vision. I believed in him. I provided the backing. I helped structure the funding. I made sure the contracts protected both of us. He told everyone I was supportive. What that really meant was I was quiet. In public, he was the visionary. The entrepreneur. The face of everything. I stood beside him, smiling, letting him take credit. At home, I was the one keeping everything balanced. I gave stability. I gave resources. I gave emotional labor. What I received was appreciation in private and distance in public. At the time, I thought that was normal. I told myself strong marriages didn't need applause. I didn't realize I was slowly being reduced to an accessory. The changes didn't arrive loudly. They slipped in quietly, disguised as stress. He started taking meetings without telling me. Decisions we used to discuss became things I found out about later. When I asked questions, he'd smile and say, "I've got it handled," like I was a child checking on homework. At dinners with potential investors, he would interrupt me mid-sentence. If I offered insight, he'd redirect the conversation back to himself. Once, when someone complimented my financial background, he laughed and said, "She just keeps the spreadsheets pretty." People chuckled. I noticed. He stopped asking my opinion on design choices, menu pricing, staffing projections. He told me to focus on appearances instead. "Just look beautiful for the opening," he said one evening, adjusting my dress like I was part of the decor. I told myself he was overwhelmed. I told myself success was changing him. I told myself not to be sensitive. But there were moments that lingered. The way he spoke over me. The way he referred to my investment as our money when it suited him and my business when it didn't. The way his tone sharpened whenever I asked about timelines or repayment. Friends brushed it off. His colleagues didn't see anything wrong. "He's just under pressure," they said. I began choosing silence over conflict. Not because I was weak. Because I didn't yet understand what was happening. I thought patience would bring him back. I didn't realize patience was teaching him that I would tolerate being diminished. Once construction neared completion, his confidence shifted into something sharper. He started introducing me differently. Not as his partner. As my wife. That was it. At industry mixers, he'd stand slightly in front of me, answering questions meant for both of us. If I tried to add context, he'd place a hand on my back, not affectionately, but firmly, guiding me into silence. Behind closed doors, he became impatient. He stopped pretending to value my input. When I pointed out budget overruns or vendor inconsistencies, he accused me of being negative. When I reminded him of timelines written into contracts, he said I was overthinking. "You worry too much," he told me. What he meant was, stop interfering. Publicly, he praised my support. Privately, he resented my awareness. The closer we got to opening night, the more he pulled away emotionally. He stayed out late, stopped explaining where he'd been, started guarding his phone. When I asked if something was wrong, he sighed like I was exhausting him. "You're reading into things," he said. "This is what success looks like." I watched him become someone I barely recognized. He spoke louder in rooms. He laughed harder at his own jokes. He began treating staff like extensions of his mood. And he began treating me like furniture. Still, I kept showing up. I approved final payments. I coordinated schedules. I handled last-minute issues with suppliers. I reassured nervous investors' spouses while he toasted to his future. He mistook my steadiness for submission. He mistook my silence for dependency. He thought I would always be there, absorbing pressure quietly, making things easier for him. He had no idea he was teaching me exactly who he was. By the final month before opening, I felt like I was living beside a stranger. He stopped coming home before midnight. When he did, he was distracted, scrolling through messages while I talked. If I asked where he'd been, he said I was interrogating him. If I stayed quiet, he accused me of sulking. Every response was wrong. I started questioning myself. Maybe I was too intense. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe success really did change people and I needed to adapt. He began framing my concerns as emotional problems. "You're stressed," he'd say. "You're being dramatic. You don't understand how business works." I had worked in finance for years. But suddenly, according to him, I was fragile. Friends noticed I was quieter. My calls went unanswered more often. Invitations stopped coming. He had gradually folded our social world into his business circle, and without realizing it, I had been edged out of my own life. I told myself marriages go through phases. I told myself not to make waves right before the launch. So I carried everything alone. I smiled through tastings. I nodded through meetings. I dressed the way he preferred. I practiced calm even when my chest felt tight. At night, I lay awake beside him while he slept easily, wondering when I had become someone who apologized for asking basic questions about money I had provided. Still, I didn't confront him. Not because I was afraid. Because something in me was already shifting. I was tired of explaining myself to someone determined not to hear me. I began observing instead. Listening more than speaking. Remembering everything. The week before the grand opening, he told me I didn't need to attend the final investor briefing. "I've got it handled," he said, already putting on his jacket. "Just rest. You've been emotional lately." Emotional? I watched him walk out without looking back. That afternoon, I learned through a vendor that he had introduced a new silent partner. Someone I had never met. Someone whose name didn't appear on any paperwork I had approved. When I asked him about it that night, he didn't deny it. He shrugged. "I needed flexibility," he said. "You don't have to be involved in every decision." I reminded him that the capital was mine. He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled in a way that made my stomach tighten. "We're married," he said. "What's yours is mine." That was the moment something inside me finally cracked. Not loudly. Quietly. 2 days later, I discovered he had moved several operational permissions out of my access. My email was no longer copied on internal updates. My login credentials stopped working on shared financial platforms. He had erased me from the business I had funded. I stood in our kitchen holding my phone, reading automated system messages that informed me I was no longer authorized. No argument. No explanation. Just removal. I went upstairs and closed the bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of it settle. From the outside, it looked like I had lost everything. My role. My voice. My place. Anyone watching would have thought I was finished. He certainly did. I didn't confront him. I didn't threaten. I didn't cry in front of him. I made dinner. I folded laundry. I asked how construction was going. I listened while he talked about staffing problems and last-minute licensing delays. He mistook my calm for surrender. Inside, I was cataloging everything. I began saving emails. I photographed contracts. I backed up financial statements to a private drive. I recorded dates, times, names. I created a timeline of every decision that had been made without me. Not out of revenge. Out of clarity. I slept lightly. I ate little. I watched him more closely than I ever had before. He grew kinder in strange ways, buying flowers randomly, touching my shoulder in passing, as if trying to reassure himself that I was still where he had left me. He talked about future vacations. Expansion plans. A second location. He spoke as though I were still part of the picture. I let him. Because sometimes the safest thing you can do is let someone believe they are in control. The night before the opening, he stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie. "Tomorrow changes everything," he said. I smiled softly. "Yes," I replied. It already had. The clarity didn't arrive in a dramatic wave. It arrived through repetition. I noticed how he only spoke warmly to me when he needed something. How compliments appeared right before financial requests. How apologies came without change. How every disagreement ended with him positioning himself as the victim of my expectations. I started replaying past conversations in my mind. The way he had never asked directly for money, only painted dreams until I volunteered. The way he had rushed the proposal. The way he had framed every boundary as distrust. I saw the pattern. He didn't build partnership. He built dependence. He hadn't fallen out of love with me. He had finished using me. That realization hurt more than the insult at the restaurant. Because it meant the humiliation wasn't impulsive. It was planned. The divorce papers had been prepared days earlier. The envelope had been waiting in his jacket pocket. The joke had been rehearsed. He wanted witnesses. He wanted to leave me small in front of people who mattered to him. Once I accepted that, the confusion disappeared. What remained was focus. I stopped asking myself why. I started asking how. How much had been transferred? Who had signed what? Which contracts were enforceable? What leverage still existed? I returned to my training. Numbers didn't lie. Documents didn't manipulate. Agreements didn't gaslight. I pulled every file I had saved and began organizing them into categories. Funding structure. Ownership percentages. Loan terms. He thought he had erased me from the business. He didn't realize I had built its foundation. And foundations don't disappear just because someone stops acknowledging them. There was one thing he had never bothered to understand. My investment wasn't casual. It wasn't a gift. It was structured. When I transferred the money, I had insisted on formal documentation. Not because I distrusted him, but because that was how my grandmother had taught me to protect assets. The funding was issued as a private loan to the business entity. Not to him personally. The agreement included repayment schedules, collateral clauses, and a 30-day recall provision. If the loan was called and unpaid, the business assets could be legally seized. He had signed everything without reading past the signature lines. He had been too busy planning menus and press coverage to worry about fine print. I pulled up the contract and read it slowly, line by line. The language was clean. The protections were airtight. The leverage was real. I also had something else. A trail. Emails confirming my funding. Messages acknowledging my ownership stake. Meeting notes where my financial projections had been used. Screenshots of him authorizing expenses from accounts I had funded. And then there was the prenuptial agreement. The one he barely remembered signing before our wedding. It protected my inheritance. Separated assets. Defined business boundaries. Explicitly excluded marital claims on pre-existing funds. He had laughed about it at the time. Just paperwork, he'd said. Now, it was a wall he couldn't climb. He thought marriage had absorbed my resources. He was wrong. He thought public humiliation had weakened me. He was wrong. He thought I would leave quietly. He was wrong. He went to bed that night believing I was broken. I stayed awake building a case. Something shifted inside me once the paperwork was laid out in front of me. The ache in my chest softened. Not because the betrayal hurt less. But because uncertainty was gone. For weeks, I had been trying to understand him. Trying to fix something that was already hollow. Trying to earn respect from someone who had quietly decided I was expendable. That night, I stopped. I stopped replaying conversations. I stopped imagining different outcomes. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently. I realized I didn't need closure from him. I needed clarity for myself. I looked around my office, the one room in the house he never entered, and felt something close to gratitude. This space had always been mine. My work lived here. My records. My discipline. I remembered who I had been before I married him. The woman who analyzed risk for a living. The woman who built financial models while others slept. The woman who didn't confuse emotion with strategy. I wasn't his wife in that moment. I was myself again. I brewed coffee. I tied my hair back. I opened a fresh notebook and began outlining steps. No theatrics. No impulsive moves. Just sequence. He had underestimated me because I had allowed him to see only what made him comfortable. He thought I was soft because I had been gentle. He thought I was dependent because I had been loyal. He mistook composure for weakness. I didn't need revenge. I needed resolution. And I knew exactly where to start. I didn't make the call immediately. I sat there first, letting the quiet settle around me. The house felt different without his voice filling it. For years, I had moved through these rooms in response to his needs, adjusting temperature, adjusting schedules, adjusting myself. Now, for the first time, everything felt still. I opened my laptop and reviewed the documents again. Not once. 3 times. I verified routing numbers. I double-checked dates. I confirmed signature pages. I cross-referenced transaction histories with account statements. This wasn't emotion anymore. This was procedure. My grandmother used to say that panic creates mistakes, and mistakes cost more than patience ever will. So I moved slowly. I transferred my personal savings into protected accounts. I changed every password connected to shared finances. I removed my credentials from joint devices. I backed up all correspondence onto an encrypted drive. Then I printed hard copies and placed them into labeled folders. Funding agreements. Ownership clauses. Prenuptial protections. Communication trails. I packed a small overnight bag and left it in my car, not because I planned to leave, but because I refused to be caught unprepared. Only then did I call my attorney. She answered immediately. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I asked her to initiate the loan recall, her silence carried weight. Faith, she said carefully, this will collapse the business. Yes, I replied. And it will escalate the divorce. I understand. She reviewed the contract while I waited. Every clause was intact. Every protection valid. The recall could be sent at 8 in the morning. Once we ended the call, I sat alone in my office and finally let myself breathe. Not cry. Breathe. He came home late, energized by rehearsals and press confirmations. He kissed my cheek and talked about seating charts and VIP guests. I smiled when appropriate. I wished him luck. He went to sleep believing he had already won. At dawn, I made coffee and watched sunlight stretch across the kitchen floor. At exactly 8 a.m., my attorney sent the notice. I didn't feel revenge. I felt alignment. For the first time in months, my actions matched my worth. I returned to the restaurant 3 days later. Not announced. Not dramatic. Just quiet presence. The same valet stand. The same glass doors. The same marble floors that had reflected my heels the night he handed me divorce papers. Only this time, the energy was different. The staff looked nervous. Whispers followed me down the hallway. Phones were being checked more often. A manager avoided my eyes. The recall notice had already begun circulating among internal teams. Vendors had paused deliveries. One investor had requested an emergency meeting. Another had quietly pulled tentative funding. Cash flow doesn't collapse loudly at first. It tightens. I took a seat at the bar and ordered water. The hostess recognized me and hesitated, unsure whether I still belonged here. I gave her a small nod. She relaxed slightly. My husband was in the back office, arguing with someone on speakerphone. His voice carried down the corridor, sharp and unfamiliar. I waited. I watched servers move through half-empty sections. I noticed unopened wine crates stacked near the service door. I saw the executive chef pacing, checking his watch. Everything that had once felt polished now felt fragile. When he finally stepped into the dining area and saw me, his face changed. Surprise first. Then calculation. He approached slowly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. "I wanted to see how things were going," I replied. He glanced around, lowering his voice. "This isn't the time." I met his gaze calmly. "It's exactly the time." For the first time since opening night, I watched uncertainty flicker across his face. He had built this place to impress people. He had never considered that I might come back to take it apart. He pulled me aside near the private dining room, away from the guests. His voice dropped into the tone he used when he wanted control without witnesses. "Let's not do this here," he said. "We can talk at home." "There's nothing left to talk about," I replied. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "You're being emotional." I almost smiled. That word again. He told me the recall notice was aggressive. That it would scare investors. That it made me look unstable. "You don't want to be responsible for ruining people's jobs," he said. "There are staff here who depend on this place." I studied his face. He wasn't worried about the staff. He was worried about himself. He leaned closer. "You know this business only exists because of me." That was when he made his mistake. He said it casually. Confidently. Loud enough that the restaurant manager standing nearby could hear. "Only because of me." I let the silence stretch. "I funded it," I said quietly. He scoffed. "You gave money. That's not the same as building something." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of contracts, payment schedules, ownership acknowledgements, and his own email authorizations. "You signed all of this," I said. He didn't look. He waved it away. "You're my wife. It doesn't matter." It mattered. Very much. He started listing everything he'd done for me. Trips, jewelry, access, connections. As if any of it equaled the millions I had invested. As if marriage erased documentation. As if charm replaced contracts. He was talking too much. And every word was helping me. He admitted he had moved permissions. He admitted he had brought in another partner without informing me. He admitted he believed I wouldn't act. A server paused nearby, pretending to wipe a table. The manager didn't leave. He had become so used to being obeyed that he forgot who might be listening. Arrogance makes people careless. And careless people create witnesses. The emergency investor meeting was called that afternoon. He didn't invite me. I attended anyway. The private dining room filled quickly, suited men, sharp-eyed women, legal advisors pretending not to take sides yet. The air was thick with tension and expensive cologne. My husband stood at the head of the table, pacing slightly as he spoke. He framed the recall as a misunderstanding. He described me as overwhelmed. He suggested personal issues were interfering with business decisions. I took a seat quietly near the end. I waited. He spoke for 10 minutes straight, explaining projections, reassuring everyone, promising temporary solutions. He used confident language. He avoided numbers. Finally, one investor asked directly, "Is the funding secure?" That's when I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I opened my folder and began placing documents on the table. One by one. The loan agreement. The repayment schedule. The recall clause. Proof of transfer. Email confirmations. Ownership acknowledgements. I let the papers do the talking. I explained, calmly, that the capital had been issued as a private loan. That the business entity was legally obligated to repay within 30 days. That failure would trigger asset seizure under contract law. I pointed to his signature. Then to the collateral clause. Then to the prenup. No dramatics. Just facts. The room changed. Phones came out. Advisors leaned forward. One investor quietly asked for copies. Another requested verification from legal. My husband tried to interrupt. I didn't respond. I simply continued laying out the timeline. How funds had been transferred. How decisions had been made without my authorization. How access had been removed. How I had been publicly humiliated and served divorce papers while still legally bound to the business. His confidence collapsed in real time. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. A woman across the table shook her head slowly. The man who had called me rusty now looked small. Not because I attacked him. Because truth removes masks. I finished by stating that I had no intention of negotiating emotionally. Only legally. Then I sat down. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was heavy. Everyone understood what had just happened. They weren't witnessing a marital dispute. They were watching a financial reckoning. The unraveling didn't explode. It leaked. One investor stood and excused himself to take a call. Another began scrolling through documents on his tablet, his jaw tightening. A third quietly messaged someone under the table. My husband tried to regain control of the room. He promised bridge funding. He offered revised projections. He spoke faster. No one listened. They were already doing the math. Without my capital, the restaurant couldn't sustain operations past a few weeks. Vendor contracts would default. Payroll would miss. Expansion plans evaporated. A senior partner cleared his throat. You failed to disclose the funding structure, he said evenly. My husband opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Another investor asked if the additional silent partner had been informed of the recall. He hadn't. That realization landed hard. People began gathering their belongings. Legal advisors exchanged looks. The executive chef, who had been waiting outside the room, was quietly informed that service would be suspended for the evening. Word traveled fast. By the time we stepped back into the main dining area, guests were already being told that operations were closing early due to unforeseen circumstances. Some recognized me. Whispers followed. Phones lifted. A woman near the bar murmured, "That's her." My husband stood frozen near the host's stand, staring at his reflection in the glass doors. The man who had once commanded every room now couldn't control his own breathing. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't need to. The consequences were already moving faster than emotion ever could. Staff began removing table settings. A delivery truck idled outside, waiting for instructions that would never come. His empire didn't fall with screaming or chaos. It folded in on itself. Quietly. Exactly the way he had tried to fold me. The news broke before the valet finished bringing around my car. Someone had already tipped off a business blogger who specialized in failed luxury startups. By the time I reached the end of the driveway, my phone was vibrating with alerts. Flagship restaurant opening delayed amid funding dispute. That was the polite headline. Inside, it was chaos. Suppliers were canceling deliveries in real time. A beverage distributor voided their agreement. The linen company demanded immediate payment before releasing inventory. 2 senior managers quietly resigned before midnight. My husband's assistant called me 6 times in 10 minutes. I didn't answer. Then his lawyer tried. Then his brother. Then him. 30 missed calls stacked on my screen like evidence. I watched them without emotion. Because this part wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. At home, I poured a glass of water and opened my laptop. I finalized the recall notice to the escrow account. I forwarded documentation to the compliance officer overseeing the investor group. I attached the original funding agreement, highlighting the clause that allowed unilateral withdrawal in the event of reputational harm. The clause he had signed without reading. He had always skimmed paperwork when I handed it to him. He trusted me. Or maybe he just assumed I would never move against him. By morning, 3 articles were live. One mentioned unexpected investor withdrawal. Another hinted at internal instability. A third questioned whether the restaurant had ever been fully capitalized. His name was trending locally. Not in a flattering way. He showed up at the house just after sunrise. Hair undone. Shirt wrinkled. Eyes red. He stood in the doorway like someone who had been evicted from his own life. "Faith," he said hoarsely. "Please. We need to talk." I looked at him calmly. There was nothing left to discuss. He stepped fully into the living room like he still belonged there. He didn't. Behind him, his phone kept vibrating. He ignored it. "I was angry," he said. "I said something stupid. You didn't have to destroy everything." Destroy. The word almost made me smile. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up my tablet. "You remember this?" I asked, sliding it toward him. He glanced down. It was the original investment agreement. Not the one his lawyer drafted later. The first one. The one he had begged me to fund when the restaurant was still just a sketch on a napkin. His signature was at the bottom. My name was listed as majority silent partner. He swallowed. "You knew," he said slowly. "I always knew," I replied. Then I opened the next file. A recorded board call from 6 months earlier. His voice filled the room. Bragging. Laughing. Promising investors that I was just the money. That I wouldn't interfere. That I was comfortable staying invisible. His face drained of color. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I sent that recording to the investor group last night," I said. "Along with your messages about hiding construction overruns." His knees buckled slightly. What did you do? He whispered. I leaned forward. I didn't attack you, I said quietly. I documented you. At that exact moment, his phone rang again. He answered on speaker. It was his lead investor. They were invoking breach of fiduciary duty, freezing remaining accounts, launching an internal review, and referring his statements to their legal team. He dropped the phone. It clattered against the floor like something already broken. He looked at me like he was finally seeing me for the first time. Not as his wife. Not as his backup. But as the person who had quietly been holding every lever. You called me Rusty, I said. My voice stayed even. You forgot I built the machine. He sank onto the couch. I stood. Untouchable.